Welcome to configuring and using Trident for Kubernetes and Openshift. In this presentation, we will be looking how we can configure and use Trident for Kubernetes to provision persistent volumes dynamically, as well as configure and use Trident for Openshift to provision persistent volumes dynamically. We will now examine how to configure and use Trident for Kubernetes. Before we start, make sure that Trident is installed and running on the Kubernetes cluster. Create a backend JSON file with the required parameters. Using the backend JSON file, create the new backend on Trident. Create the storage class YAML file with the required parameters. Create the new storage class using the kubectl create command. Create a persistent volume claim YAML file. Create the persistent volume claim using the kubectl create command. Using the PVC created, create a pod YAML file. Now deploy the pod using the kubectl create command. Please stand by as we take you through the steps described above. Verify if Trident is installed on the Kubernetes cluster. Create the backend JSON file. Create the backend on Trident. Verify if backend is created. Examine the created backend. Check for the storage driver name, the aggregates used. Create a storage class YAML file and create the storage class. Verify and examine the storage class. The storage class has been created. Create the PVC YAML file. Create the PVC. The persistent volume claim is created and the PV is provisioned by Trident. Examine the PVC. The persistent volume claim has created a persistent volume. The persistent volume of 3 GB has been provisioned as NFS mount. Create the pod YAML file and create the pod. The pod is created and is in running state. The volume has been successfully mounted on the container and the pod is instantiated. We have now seen how Trident dynamically provisions persistent volume in Kubernetes upon receiving a PVC and how it can be attached to a pod in Kubernetes. Configuring and using Trident for Openshift. Before we begin, make sure that Trident is installed and running on the Openshift cluster. Create a backend JSON file with the required parameters. Using the backend JSON file, create a new backend on Trident. Create the storage class YAML file with the required parameters. Using the storage class YAML file, create a new storage class. Open the Openshift GUI and create a new project. From the catalog, choose the Nginx image template. Deploy a sample application. For the deployment, create a new storage. Choose the storage class Gold. Input the PVC name and the mount point. Attach the PV to the pod. Please stand by as we walk you through the steps that we have described above. Open the Openshift GUI and log in. Create a new project. Open the new project. Browse the templates available. Choose the Nginx template. Input an application name and use the sample application from the repository. Open the Actions button and select Add Storage. Click on Create Storage. The storage class Gold that had been created is visible in the drop-down menu. Select the storage class Gold from the drop-down menu. Enter a PVC name. Give the required size and click Create. Give the desired mount path. Give the desired volume name and click Add. As you can see, the persistent volume has been created. Open the deployment. Observe that the volume Nginx 1 Volume 1 has been mounted. Observe the PVC that provisioned the persistent volume. The deployment is up and running. Let us now inspect the Openshift cluster. List the PVCs available on the Nginx deployment project. Examine the persistent volume available on the Nginx storage PVC. Check the pod for the project Nginx deployment project. Log into the pod and check if the volumes have been mounted. The mount command shows that the persistent volume has been mounted on the pod. We have now seen how Trident dynamically provisions persistent volume in Openshift cluster upon receiving a persistent volume claim, and how it can be attached to a deployment in Openshift. To recap, we have seen how we can configure and use Trident for Kubernetes to provision persistent volumes dynamically, and configure and use Trident for Openshift to provision persistent volumes dynamically. Thank you very much.